Here we are again with another recorded lecture, and this is the lecture on Romanticism by me, Laura Struve. Okay, I wanted to start with a quotation from William Blake, who we will be taking up at the end of the week. So, this is a quotation from one of Blake's poems called Auguries of Innocence. To see a world in a grain of sand, and heaven in a wild flower, hold infinity in the palm of your hand, and eternity in an hour. This is a poem about paradoxes, about being able to see the infinite in the finite, right, in the very small, the big world juxtaposed with the grain of sand. I want you to notice the natural images that Blake is interested in: sand, wildflower, but also these incredibly large, expansive concepts: heaven, infinity, eternity, etc. This is extremely typically romantic with a capital R. So, and we'll talk a little bit about Auguries of Innocence in class on Wednesday because I'm giving you the handout. Okay, major romantic writers. Do not write any of this down. In poetry, Blake, Wordsworth, Coleridge, Shelley, Byron, and Keats. These are often referred to as the Big Six. But there are other important romantic poets as well. Robert Southey, Felicia Hemans, and Letitia Landon are two very important female romantic poets. We have very important prose fiction writers: Jane Austen, Sir Walter Scott, Mary Shelley. When we read a novel for the romantic section, we're going to read Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. But you don't have to write all these names down. You don't need, just, there were a lot of them. That's important to know. Okay, when did this period start? Well, that's a little, some people would say 1798, with the publication of a book of poems called Lyrical Ballads that was jointly published by Wordsworth and Coleridge together, and it had both of their poems in it. So a lot of people would say 1798, but some people might say 1789 with the start of the French Revolution. That's really when it started. Either of these dates is fine, just as long as you know which one is which. When did it end? Well, that's also open to debate. Somewhere in perhaps around the 1830s at some point. 1832 is often given as an end date because that's the date of the first Reform Bill. Definitely ends by 1837, when Queen Victoria ascends to the throne. So, depending on how you define it, this is a period of about 30 to 50 years in English literary history. So just be aware of the kind of very general dates, when it starts, when it ends. This is the kind of thing that would be on an exam. So you should definitely have written this stuff down. Thematic elements of romantic literature. The first is a belief in the natural goodness of man, that people are naturally good. Also, a commitment to the power of emotion. In this sense, they are rejecting that Enlightenment emphasis on the power of reason. The Romantics see themselves as revolutionaries, as radicals, as rebels. They will be rejecting a lot of the Enlightenment things that we saw before. A phrase that's really important for this idea of emotion, Wordsworth is going to talk about emotion recollected in tranquility. And we will talk a lot about that. Also, the power of the imagination. Again, very different from the Enlightenment. The Romantics were concerned, they wanted to do something new and original. They saw themselves as visionaries, as prophets. When we get to Nightingale with Keats, we will talk about how Keats talks about the imagination in terms of negative capability. Romantics also focused on the self, individualism, and independence. This can turn into solitariness or exile, but focus on the self. Spontaneity, very important for Romantics. Political support for liberty. They supported a lot of causes that were connected to liberty, freedom of some kind. They're also interested in the exotic or the primitive. They're interested in the power of the sublime, and we will talk more about the sublime next week. And they were interested in nature and the supernatural both. So those are a lot of these thematic elements. We are going to come back to these again and again. So have them in a place in your notes that you can go back to refer to them. We will use them in class. We will talk about these when we do Blake. So, and then all of our other romantic authors. So have this in a place where you can come back to it. There are also formal elements of Romanticism. A turn away from overly formal artistic elements, or a turn away from into more like poetic forms that are more free or less rigid than the Enlightenment's rhymed couplets. They chose everyday language over what they felt was artificially heightened poetic diction. They also focus on particular forms of poetry, lyric poetry in particular, and next week we'll talk about the romantic lyric poem. So we'll go into more depth on some of these formal elements. Okay, this is probably a good place to pause.